Welcome to Unstoppable Real Estate Investing Wealth. My name is Billy Alvaro, aka the Unstoppable VA, former billion-dollar mortgage banker, gone bankrupt, turned professional real estate investor. Where each week you'll learn the tools, strategies, systems, and secrets myself and other highly successful real estate investing entrepreneurs use to start, grow, and scale their businesses, creating massive profits, and how you can too. And we'll teach you how to put those profits to work so you no longer have to. Get ready to finally experience financial freedom and generational wealth. Now let's get started. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Unstoppable REI Wealth. I'm your host, Billy Alvaro, the Unstoppable BA, here to bring it another episode with another special guest. So today I'm interviewing a young man, Daniel Kwak, who came to this country. Read your bio, bro. Very impressed. Came here with like not even 2 cents to rub together. And at 20 years old, you had a negative net worth. And now here you are, many years later with a huge rental portfolio, and you're teaching students all around the country. Daniel, welcome to the show, bro.
Hey, thanks for having me on, man. I'm honored.
Appreciate you coming on. So listen, I'm just curious, how old are you now?
I'm 27, about to turn 28.
Damn, prime time, brother, prime time. So take us back. You got into this business when you were 20 years old, and reading your bio, it said that you were dead broke. You had no money in the bank.
Yeah.
And you and your family, I think, immigrated here, and you were kind of like just really struggling trying to get yourselves together when you first came to the States.
Yeah, but I mean, in hindsight, I look back and I'm super grateful and thankful, right? Because I mean, if I didn't have the background I didn't have, I don't think I would have worked as hard as I do now. And I definitely value the dollar, more than, I think most kids, when I grew up. So yeah, we immigrated to the country when I was 5 years old. And, my dad was and still is today. He's a church pastor. So, I'm a pastor's kid and whatnot. And I don't know if you know a lot about pastors, but they don't really make a whole lot of money.
Right.
Unless you're one of the ones that are on TV, asking people to buy this prayer rock and it's going to, help enhance your life. And, and you're around, flying private jets, right? Like, unless you're on TV, pastors generally, they don't make a lot of money, nor should they, I believe. Right. But so 5 years old, we were broke. Right. And I guess that's one way to put it. Most nights we were sleeping, especially during the winter in the car because we couldn't afford to pay the heating bill. And
God,
I remember one time our family, we were at the park and I saw my mom. She was picking up these weeds and she was putting them in this plastic container. And I was wondering, what's she doing? And 3 hours later, I got my answer because it was on the dinner table. So,
wow.
It was very interesting dichotomy that I grew up in. But I'll tell you the experience that kind of shifted everything for me. Everybody has their origin story, right? Like Peter Parker has the story of the spider biting his hand, and Batman has the story of his parents dying in the alleyway and whatnot. And fortunately, that wasn't my experience. But we lived next to the first apartment we lived in. We lived next to, let's call it I don't know how many kids watch your show, but let's call it a gentleman's entertainment center for now. Right? And I remember I was 6 years old. This was still our first year living in America. And it was about 1:30 a.m. in the morning. And I looked out the window and I'm watching people leave this gentleman's entertainment center. And there was one guy that stuck, that caught my eye, right? He stood out. And this guy was stumbling out the door. And it doesn't take much to understand that this guy had a really expensive suit on, right? Like even at 6 years old, like you can tell if something's really expensive, something's valuable, right? And so, he's got a nice watch on, really shiny, it shines when the street light hits it. Really nice suit, gets in a really nice car. I don't remember what exactly the car was, but I do remember an L, right, as the emblem. Obviously, it's Lexus, right? So he's getting in the car and whatnot, and I see him drive away. And what was really interesting is right after that, I turned 90 degrees to my left, and I see my parents who literally would give the last shirts off their back to help somebody else. They were just the most God-fearing, kind-hearted people. So I turned to my left, and I see my parents sleeping in a twin bed in a room that doubled as their bedroom. Actually, not only just doubled, but it was their bedroom, it was our dining room, it was also our kitchen.
Wow.
And also part of our living room. And my brother and I, we didn't even have a bed. We were sleeping on the floor at the time in sleeping bags because we can afford one, right? So the question I asked myself was, well, what if, right? Like, what if that guy who stumbled out of the Gentleman's Entertainment Center, what if he had the same heart that my dad did? And then vice versa. What if people like my dad, who had this desire and this passion to help out his fellow man, to impact communities, what if he had the skill set of the guy who was stumbling out of the Gentleman's Entertainment? Like, what would the world look like? How differently would people's lives look? How differently would the world look? And I'm convinced, and I'm on a mission, right, to find out what that looks like and to create that, right? Because it's certainly not happening to its greatest capacity right now. So that was my background. Fast forward, like you said, I was 18 years old, had negative $187.65 in my bank account. And it wasn't that I was broke. It was more that I was farther away from creating that world where, you know, people who were wealthy also had the heart for good, right? I was farther away from that mission than when I was 6, because when you're 6, I had zero money. When I was 18, I had negative $187.65 in my bank account. So that's what got me to start learning about real estate and learning about finance. So probably 18, 19, that's when I really started learning about finance in general. And then at 20, that's probably when I learned more specifically about real estate investing, because it took 2 years for me to understand that real estate was really kind of the best option there when it comes to investing.
I find it interesting, Daniel, that at that young age, you were able to look and kind of make this connection. You know, I'm sure you thought about this as an adult, that was like a pivotal moment for you, making that connection. And I see, because prior to coming onto the show, we were speaking, like, you're big in the community, you're giving back to students and you're coaching. And I want to get into that, but I can see why you're on this mission and you're on this path because of how you were raised, what you dealt with as a young man, and seeing how it was to have a mom and dad with such a good heart, being a good place, but yet, financially not have the means to make that connection. Good for you, man.
Yeah. And part of that reason is because when you're a kid, it's just an observation, right? It's just like, well, like, red is red, the sky is blue, the grass is green. Like, it's just, you're just literally making an observation. And it seems so simple, but yet it's so interesting, like I get flagged for saying this, and this is a bit of a controversial statement, but I cannot stand the word legacy. Like, when people like use the legacy as their motivation, I can't stand it, because at the end of the day, unless your name is, Jesus Christ or Muhammad Gandhi or, one of these, or even Martin Luther King, 50, 100, 200 years from now, no one will know who we are. Like, it doesn't matter how much money you make. It doesn't matter how big you try to make yourself. At the end of the day, like, no one's going to remember our name. Like, I have a buddy named Alex who recently said on another podcast, like, life is like a casino, right? Like, you go in, you play your cards, you get your chips, and you accumulate as much chips as you possibly can. But instead of cashing out the casino like you originally would, you actually move your chips all the way back in the middle of the table for everybody else to win, because that's what happens when you die, right? Like, your all the money that you accumulate either goes to your benefactors or it goes to charities of some sort. It re-enters the economy, right? So for that reason, that observation I made when I was 6 years old, I was like, all right, like, while I'm here, on this earth in a very short span of time, because every 60, 70, 80-year-old that I've talked to throughout the years, they're like, yeah, you blink and you go from somebody your age to somebody my age. While I'm here for a very short time, like, I might as well try to make this place better, right? As opposed to trying to make money so I could drive cars that I don't really need to drive, or live in houses that I don't really need to live in. If that makes sense.
100%, Daniel, 100%. I love it. Let's get into, you started, looking at finance at 18 years old. Who did you study? What got you motivated at 20 years old to get onto this road to financial freedom and creating, massive wealth the way you're doing?
Yeah. So it's one of the things actually I wrote. So I wrote a book like 3 years ago, and it's free. That's why I mentioned it. If I was charging, I'd be like, all right, maybe I wouldn't mention it. But it's free. So I mentioned in the book, never. So you ever heard the phrase "follow your passion and the money will come"?
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not the biggest believer in that statement, because I love the idea of following your curiosity and not your passion. Because at the end of the day, when I was studying finances, to answer your question, when I was 18, 19 years old, I was just trying to figure out why my parents and my family grew up broke while everybody else didn't. like that's what I was ultimately trying to figure out, and that was the question that I was trying to ask. So I would listen to anything and everything I could find on finance. I mean, I would go to the library. I pull the old fashioned card. I'd go on YouTube. I listened to guys like, I mean, it didn't matter who they were, right? Whether it was Ty Lopez or Grant Cardone or Jordan Belt, like any of these guys, I would just anything I could grab my hands on, I would listen to, right? Because they knew something I didn't, clearly.
Yep. I love it. And then, so what made you decide to get into the real estate world at 20? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah. So I read an article when I was 17 by Forbes magazine that it says that like 76% of the top 1% made their money by investing in real estate. And not only that, but I'm being from Chicago. I'm a diehard Chicago Bulls fan. And I know we didn't have that great of a season, but hey, but our owner, the guy who owned the Bulls since like 1984, right? It's a guy named Jerry Reinsdorf. And he actually made his money investing in commercial real estate in the Chicagoland area. So I was like, oh, well, like if the owner of the Bulls, right, which is like I'm a diehard fan of, made his money by investing in real estate, and that's how he bought the team. And the top 1% of people, they made their money through real estate, because we're talking about wealth here, right? Like that's where I want to be at. I want to be at that level, and I want to study the things that whatnot. So I studied a lot of different things in finance, and then I actually learned that because real estate for me is actually not the end goal. So the last 3 years, my focus wasn't even on real estate; it was actually buying and scaling businesses. But I've learned that real estate is a lot like so. A lot of my martial arts fans will appreciate this, but it's a lot like learning wrestling. So if you're trying to be in the UFC or trying to be an MMA fighter, learning real estate, it's like learning wrestling. It's such foundational for everything else that you're going to learn. It's kind of like learning the piano before you learn every other instrument. Because at the end of the day, when you're buying businesses or when you're really in business in general, you learn in real estate such valuable tactics like how to analyze an income stream, how to assess the risk, how to assess the reward, how to do value add, how to increase ancillary income. I mean, you learn so many different things, like how to read a market. You learn so many of these fundamental things in the world of real estate. And if you learn, you can apply it to everything else. So I had a mentor of mine that told me that, very early on in my career. So that's why I was like, all right, I'm going to be really successful in real estate first, because I know that's going to set the foundation for me in every other industry.
I love it. So your focus has been what? Buy and hold, single families, multifamilies? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so it's been buy and hold, because at the end of the day, that's the vision that I have for my life, right? I mean, we talk about having a vision and a mission for our businesses, and yet we never have a vision and a mission for our personal life, which I think is actually even more important, because it's the personal life that drives the business decisions. So my spiel, my philosophy is I do something that the 10-year-old older version of me is going to thank me for. So I very seldom sell a business because I don't know. I feel like if I sell it and I walk away with a bunch of money, it's like the ability to impact people, whether it's the employees or the tenants, it minimizes, right? So that's my philosophy. I do buy and hold real estate nowadays. If we're going to get into like what the market's doing, nowadays I actually focus more on intrinsic value, C to B, long-term fixed rate seller financing deals. That's what I'm focusing on today.
So I want to give some. Now I want to get into the teaching part of it. I got your background, and it was we're up to this point. Now I want to start giving some real meat to the listeners, like the how-tos, the tools, the tips, the tricks, systems, secrets. What do you do specifically, seller financing? Walk us through deals. I want to get some coaching in for the people who are listening.
I love it. And that's actually one of the questions I get a lot is like, Daniel, how do I get seller financing? How do I convince the seller to do seller financing with me? So first and foremost, I'm not a great salesperson. I think I'm a good salesperson. I wouldn't classify myself as a great salesperson. What I am really, really good at, though, is creating a situation where people want to buy from me. That's what I'm really, really good at. So let me show you how that applies to seller financing. So by the way, when I was 20 years old, I had a conversation with a mortgage lender or a commercial lender, and he literally laughed in my face, right? Because I told him that I wanted to get a loan to buy an apartment building, and I told him my DTI and my liquidity situation. And he's like, "Yeah, kid, you're not getting it." So I actually had to do seller financing. So I reverse engineered. I didn't know I was doing this at the time, but you can actually, and your listeners can actually use this today. So I asked myself, okay, how do I create a win-win scenario for myself and the seller if we're doing seller financing. Because I knew with research, I knew that seller financing had a bit of a negative connotation with a lot of sellers out there. They weren't the biggest fans of it. They were very hesitant, as I found. So I researched for about 2 weeks all the benefits that seller financing has for the seller. And I came up with top 3. So one of them was tax deference, potential tax deference. Number 2 was making money as the bank. At the end of the day, the banks are the richest entities in the world. So I knew that had some pull. And then number 3 is the continuation of passive income. So I wrote those 3 things down. And at the end of the day, I wrote like 15, 20, right? And a lot of them, like half of them were a bit of a stretch, but I wrote them down regardless. So spent 2 weeks doing that. And then I asked myself, who are the people that are going to resonate the most with that message? Because one of the things I don't think people talk about is, a lot of people know how to do deals. They don't really know how to build a business. Because if you're talking about real estate investing wealth, unstoppable real estate investing wealth, you got to build a business. You can't just continue to do deals. You'll get rich doing that, but you won't be wealthy. And there's a difference between rich and wealthy. So I spent about another week deciding who resonates with that product. Because if we're talking building a business, we got to have a product, right? We're always selling a product, and most people don't know what that is. Even with raising capital, most people struggle with raising capital because they don't know what their product is. They don't know what they're selling. So I spent another week trying to decide, okay, who resonates the most with that message? And all this time, I'm talking to peers, I'm talking to mentors. I'm constantly getting feedback because, well, what do the top businesses in the world, what do they do, right? They get feedback on their product before they launch it onto the market, right? I mean, it's marketing 101, right? And yet we don't do that in real estate. It's funny, right? So I spent another week, getting feedback. Okay, great. And after a week, I made a decision that the people who resonated most with those benefits were seasoned landlords. Let's call them that, right? So older landlords, right? That's what I'm trying to say.
Yep.
It's 2022. You got to be worried about who you offend nowadays, right? So older landlords.
I don't worry about any of that shit. I'll offend anybody, anytime, any place. It's just
that's right. I tell people, look, I won't offend, but I will be honest, right? Like I'll be me 100% of the time. I'll be honest, regardless of what anybody else thinks.
Yeah.
So it was older landlords, seasoned landlords. So then I started thinking to myself, okay, how do I find these guys? So I know who my target demographic is. I know who the people that are going to resonate the most with my messages.
Right.
Now, how do I find them? Right. And it certainly wasn't the Zillows. It wasn't it wasn't all these things that people use nowadays. So I got it down to 3 things. I spent, as funny as it sounds, I spent a bit of time talking to seasoned landlords. But hey, like, how do I find you? Right? Like, what are ways that you're putting yourself out there? And, how do I get in touch with you, phone them? So I came up with 3 ways at the end of the day. So number 1 was newspaper ads. So I would look through the newspaper once a week and I would see the for rent ads that were on the newspapers. Because I started asking myself, what was the primary ways of advertising and marketing properties 20, 30 years ago? Because that's probably when they were in the prime of, their professional careers. So newspaper ads, and then also driving around and calling for rent signs that were out. So, not the for sale signs, but the for rent signs. And I would call those numbers because that meant that this was an older landlord who most likely still managed the building and probably didn't want to manage the building for long, right? So I found myself motivated. So, and last but not least, this was my number 1 way of finding deals, finding seller financing deals specifically, was building relationships with property managers who have been in that area for 20, 25 plus years. I wanted to meet the 55, 60-year-old landlords, and I wanted to get, in bed with their buddies. That's what I wanted, right? So I created a little arrangement where if they have a client that wants to sell their building, well, for the property manager, that's not great because that means they lose the management account, right? They lose the amount of units that they're managing. Yep. So I would tell the property manager, like, hey, I'll solve your problem. Have them call me first before they put on the MLS. And if I buy it, I'll keep you as the property manager. That way you're virtually guaranteeing that you never lose your business.
I love it.
Love
it. How many units were you able to pick up using those strategies?
So using that strategy alone, I got 64 units in 1 year.
64 units in 1 year, all seller finance?
Yeah.
All right. So take us through the script when you're talking to an investor.
Perfect.
You're talking to a landlord. I want to train the people that are listening.
Yeah. So obviously that's the setup, right? So I always tell people, like, you got to have a setup. It's like boxing. You can't just come in with a haymaker, right? Like you got to throw a couple of jabs first, right?
Yeah.
So that's the jab. That's the setup. So that now I know that these are the people who want my product. Okay. Now the sales process becomes 90% easier because I don't have to convince somebody. And that's what most people do in real estate. Is like, it just blows my mind, whether you're raising capital, whether you're negotiating, like 90% of people are trying to sell something to someone that they don't want. They don't want that product that you have. In this case, people did. So I sat down with them.
You went out, you identified your avatar, you figured out who your avatar is, you cultivated the things that are going to resonate with that avatar, which is the tax deferral, acting like a bank, passive income. And I'm sure then you just went right in. It was an easier sell because these landlords are already used to receiving money on a monthly basis, right? They're not,
That's exactly
not
right.
like a regular homeowner who's selling their house, where they're like, I don't get this seller financing thing. I'm going to be on the hook for the mortgage if you do subject to. An investor kind of understands tax benefits, cash flow. I mean, those are the two biggest things.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, these guys, they've been receiving a check in the mail for 30 plus years. So, for a lot of them, they were kind of hesitant to take a lump sum of cash, which I totally understand, right? Like if you have an income stream for 30 years, why would you want it to go away? But the virtual sell, the value was, hey, how would you like to continue that income stream without having to manage the property, without having to wake up at 2, 3 a.m. and fix a toilet or whatever you have to do.
I'm curious. I have a question for you. So regarding these old timers, your experience, you found that a lot of these guys had property managers, these single family owners had property managers that were managing their properties, or did they really manage them themselves? And
they were managing it themselves. And these weren't even single family homes. They were, man, and remember I bought a portfolio of single family. I bought a couple of them, but for the most part, these guys, they were owning 8 units, 16 units, 12 units, the 24 units. Like these were the landlords that I was doing these type of deals with. So that was a big value, right? Because you're talking about Mr. and Mrs. Jones who's renting out, 2 or 3 houses, right? Because Johnny went off to college, right? Or that's one avatar, but the other avatar is, well, hey, I've owned 60 units, these 60 units for 20 years, 25 years. So, that was a completely different, avatar. So what I would do when I would sit down with them is I wouldn't. So this is my mentality going into each and every negotiation or meeting with an investor or whatnot. A lot of people get nervous, right? So I've been teaching and coaching real estate investors, entrepreneurs for a good amount of time now. I know I'm 27, but I've been doing it now for almost a third of my life, right? So one of the things that I hear constantly is people get nervous, right, when they talk to a seller. And I'm like, well, why are you nervous? Right. And 90% of the time people say, well, I don't know what to say. Right. Like if I had a script, that's why everybody loves scripts. Everybody loves outlines because at the end of the day, they just want to know what to say that's going to get them the result. I'm not a big believer in scripts. I hate, like, you can talk to my clients. They'll say, yeah, Daniel does not like scripts because I think it actually robs people of being their authentic self when it comes to entrepreneurship, which I believe is their greatest weapon. But I talk to, people get nervous. Well, Daniel, I don't know what to say. And I said, well, that's your problem. That's why you're nervous, right? Because when I walk into a negotiation with a seller, I'm not actually more concerned about what I say. I'm more concerned about how well I listen. Because really, at the end of the day, if you want to be a great negotiator or a good salesperson, just be a great listener. Like people tell you exactly what they want.
Yeah.
All you have to do is just regurgitate that information back to them and find a way to monetize the value.
Or they might not tell you exactly what they want, but you'll identify a potential problem or a major problem that you can then come in and solve.
Oh, that's exactly right. So for me, I care so much about the psychographics of the seller, of the investor, right? Like in business, you talk about demographics and geographics. For me, I care about psychographics. I want to know at the end of the day how people think, what drives them to make a decision. So even when somebody says, right, like for an example, if an investor tells me like, oh, Daniel, like, are you putting any of this money in your deal? Like at the end of the day, they don't really care about that. They don't really care whether or not I put money in a deal. What they're really asking is, Daniel, can I trust you? Like, do you have any skin in the game? And so it's funny because like even when I teach people like raising capital and people throw out that objection, I tell people like, well, meet it head on, be authentic, right? Just literally just say like, hey, John, is it possible that you're asking that question because you're more worried about, trusting this deal, trusting me and me having skin in the game? Is that correct? Right. So even with sellers, I try to get to the real reason. So like everybody teaches like, oh, the first question you should be asking is, why are you selling? Right. Like you go to any boot camp or seminar or you buy any real estate investing course, like that's the first question a lot of people teach others and their students to ask is, why are you selling? I ask that question 3 times throughout our conversation, because I know for a fact that 90% of landlords won't give me the real answer in the first time. I know that for a fact. Right? As a matter of fact, I use something called social jujitsu, right? So I also talk about this in my book and I expand, but I'll talk about it briefly here. So if you think about the art of what jujitsu is, like especially Brazilian jujitsu, it was actually invented by a guy who was pretty much sick and tired of bigger, stronger people beating him up, right? And I'm only 5'9", 155 pounds, right? So I practiced martial arts my whole life, but I was like, oh man, like I'm having to spar against these guys that are like 6 foot 180, 6 foot.
Let me ask you a quick question. When it's really windy out, do you have to walk with like cement in your shoes?
That's right. I live in Chicago, right? So it's the windy city.
Right, exactly.
So fortunately, I've been able to bulk up, throughout the years. Believe it or not, I used to be skinnier. I used to weigh way less. Not when I had a stomach issue at the time, but but yeah, it's I used to right, like have the backpack on, right, just to make me feel secure. You see an animal walking by, it's like, oh, well, at least he's holding an apple, but so what was I saying? Oh, okay, negotiating. So I got really good at listening, and the whole idea of social jujitsu is it's just like regular jujitsu in martial arts, right? Like you're using the other person's strength and weight against them, right? So if you think about some of the most common interactions that will happen between a buyer and a seller, right? Typically, the posture of the seller 90% of the time is, you got to buy this building. This thing is a cash cow. They try to prop up the value of the asset. Right. It happens all the time. Right. So it's like, oh, well, like this is not, the tenants, they're not drug users. They're pharmaceuticals. Right. Like they try to turn everything into a positive. Right. Like, what do you mean? That's not mold. That's, historical value. Right. Like they'll try to make up anything and everything. Right. And brokers will too. Right. And, the thing that's happening right now is, well, rents are about to go up. Which, by the way, my opinion is based on what I'm seeing in terms of market data and market use and my analysis. Yes, rent is super high, but I think in about 2-3 years, it won't be as high as what people think. And I'm worried because a lot of syndicators, a lot of apartment complex buyers are predicating their entire business plan off of a rent that's projected to be higher. I don't think the tenant pool is going to be that strong, as strong as they think anyway. So social jiu-jitsu. So one of the most common things that people would ask me was, well, Daniel, this is a cash cow. Why wouldn't you want to buy this? And my social jiu-jitsu tactic was, well, Billy or John or whoever the seller is, if you don't mind me asking, if it's such a cash cow, I know you said this earlier, but why are you really selling if that's the case, if it's such a cash cow? My posture, I tell my students all the time, is when you're going into a negotiation with a seller, you have to be a freaking detective. I mean, the focus for you has to be gathering as much information as you possibly can. You don't even negotiate the first 20, 30 minutes, in my opinion, when you first walk in. You're just trying to gather as much information as you possibly can to then provide something of value to that other individual. So my posture, right, whenever they tell me that, oh, this is a cash cow, or anytime they mention something positive about the property, right, I'm going to say about 2 or 3 times in that whole interaction, or I'm not going to do it every single time, but, during that 20, 30 minutes, I'm going to ask 2 or 3 times, well, John, if you don't mind me asking, if this is such a cash cow, I know initially you said this, but, why are you selling the building, right? And then you kind of get the real answers as to why they're doing it.
So let me ask you this. I want to just focus in a little bit. Walk me through, you're at the number stage. This guy comes down, he has his numbers, he has a property, you get your cash flow statement, you know what your income is, you know what your expenses are. What's your pitch to go through and actually try to get them to understand seller financing? Take us through that.
Yes. So after
in like 3 minutes or less, I really want to get to the punches of what.
Yeah, for sure. So after they tell me everything that they're wanting, all the value, right? Like what's the psychographics? I sit down at a table and I get a blank sheet of paper out and I draw a line in the middle and I say, okay, I'm going to give you 2 options. So number one is a cash offer. So it's $1 million. Let's say they want $1 million for the property. So it said, this is $1 million right here. I'm going to give it to you cash. And I ask a series of questions that make them rethink what they think they want. So number one, I ask is, have you talked to your CPA about your tax implications, about the sale? Because remember, number one benefit, potential tax difference, right?
Smart. So you're trying to get the whole entire thing with the tax implication, what they're going to have to pay.
That's exactly right. So have you talked to your CPA? Okay, you haven't. Okay, great. So based on my experiences with talking to individuals of you in your situation, my estimation is you're going to pay X amount in taxes, right? Okay, do you currently have the property paid off? Do you currently have a loan? You don't? Okay, great, fantastic, right? Boom, right? Click that off. And then closing costs, right, et cetera. And then there's a number, right? There's a number at the bottom that's a little bit lower than what they expected, right? So in my experience, and you'll hear in the book, my experience is in most landlords that if they started $1 million, they'll end up at 500 to 600,000, right? After taxes, after closing costs, after et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And then I draw, obviously the other half of the line, right? On the other side of the line, I say, okay, so based on what I'm hearing, I'm only mentioning this offer because of what I've heard you say, right? And of course I know, like that's why I picked the person, right?
Yep.
So on the other hand, it's like, okay, I'll still give you $1 million, right? And by the way, with the cash offer, I'm not guaranteeing you I'll give you $1 million, right? But based on what I'm seeing right now, with this second option, I will give you $1 million. That I can tell you, right? And I break down, okay, so with this option, right? And by the way, like a word wise, I never say the words owner financing. I never say the word seller financing, right? And I tell them, well, in this situation, you can actually be my bank. So from what I know, banks are the richest entities in the world. And with the second offer, you would have the opportunity to be my bank. And I would give you these terms. I would give you 10% down, 4% interest, 25-year amortization is what I would do. And you would actually make 4% on your money every single year. And so I would run through the amortizations, table with them and whatnot. And if you go to a mortgage calculator, so I use this app called Carl's Mortgage Calculator. I would recommend everyone download it. By the way, I don't have an affiliate agreement with them or anything like that. Like, it's such a great app and so simple that I use it all the time, right? So I'm literally, I have it open on my phone right now. So I'm going to put in $1 million in value.
So what was the address again? It's Carl's?
Yeah, Carl's Mortgage Calculator, KARL''S Mortgage Calculator. All right, so I put in the terms, $1 million purchase price, 10% down payment, 4% interest, 25-year amortization, which is actually strange because I literally have a student doing a 16-unit deal right now with those terms. And then you go to sum, which is at the end, and it tells you how much total you're paying throughout the course of those 30 years. And it's actually $1.425 million. So I write $1.425 million at the bottom of the sheet. And I say, okay, so without any further due diligence, without any diving into the details, and by the way, I'm telling you, even with the second option, you will have to pay taxes, but not as much as this, like very minimal compared to what you're paying in the first option, because you still do, right? But long story short, let's say that it's 1.2 million, right? Because of everything that we're not talking about here. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's move it from 1.425 million to 1.2 million. So in this case scenario, your best case in this and to the left is 600,000, right? Over here on the right is 1.2 million. In your opinion, which option? Because for me, I don't ever ask them what they want because I'm making too big of a jump. Whatever I ask them, I want to have a small jump. It's like boiling the frog, right? Like I want to have the small staircases that eventually get them to the yes that I eventually want at the end. So I tell them, based on what you're seeing right now, which option would you like to explore further? That's the exact question I asked them.
I like it.
By the way, I'm not asking them, what do you want to do? Right? I'm not asking that question. I'm asking, which option would you like to explore further? And in that case scenario, the easy option is option B, right? So after that, typically I tell them, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to verify with your tax professional on the taxes you're going to pay, which, by the way, 9 times out of 10, it's a lot, especially if they're an older landlord and they own the property for more than 27 and a half years, right? Yeah. There's all that depreciation recapture that they're going to have to face in closing, not to mention that a lot of times those guys are treated at ordinary income at the highest tax rate. Because you're talking about, even if you sell a property cash, you're paying 2 different taxes. You're paying ordinary income and you're also paying capital gains. Yep. So a lot of times those guys, their tax bill is pretty significant. Like it's way more than what they're actually wanting, So at that point, I tell them, hey, verify the taxes you have to pay with your CPA, which most of the time, right? Most of the time, it actually enhances my argument, enhances my offer. Because they come back and like, wow, this kid wasn't kidding, right? Like he wasn't lying, he was actually telling the truth. So, and by the way, I tell them never mention seller financing to their CPA, because most attorneys and CPAs, in my experience, will actually shoot down the idea. And then you have to do damage control afterwards.
So how do you get them to address that with their CPA? You just tell them to ask them what their tax implications are going to be just on selling the property for cash.
Yep, that's it. So I tell them, do me a favor, right? Like, John, do me a favor. 9 times out of 10, I tell them to email them. right? Because a lot of times when you get an email, right, you're not going to give a long, illustrious answer. You're not going to ask follow-up questions. You're just going to answer the question that the person emailed you, right? It's a lot of times going to be yes or no because you're trying to answer 1,000 other emails or texts, you know.
Yep.
So I asked them like, hey, do me a favor, email your CPA or your tax professional and ask them how much you would owe in taxes if you were to sell 1475 Green Street. Right. And just
good tips here, bro. You honestly have a couple of good tips here towards the end. I like it.
Yeah. Awesome stuff. Yeah. And so I tell them just get that number, right? And let's get back on the phone. And I always do what's called BAM FAM, right? You book a meeting from a meeting is what you do, right? So I book a meeting from that meeting. Say, hey, let's meet up in 3 days. Let's see what number you got from your CPA, and let's continue to see if this is a viable option for you. Because at the end of the day, like I don't want to do seller financing unless it does genuinely help the person, right? Like I do genuinely want to create win-win scenarios, you know, for the other individuals.
You wrote, this was solid information, by the way. Thank you, Daniel. You wrote in your in the letter when we had you come on, you said many lack capital. As an adversity, I can share how I raised millions of dollars at 21. Is this your strategy for raising money, or is it a different strategy?
No, it's a different strategy. So
all right, so let's shift gears. I want to
yeah. Go ahead.
Let's go. I don't want to spend any more than like 10 more minutes, and I want to wrap up. So let's talk about how you raise money specifically, because you're very good at raising capital. And as a young man, I would assume that you had, you know, the potential of, you're a young guy, so the credibility probably was not there. So let's talk about how'd you overcome that, and then how do you go about raising the money that you raise?
Yeah, no, fantastic. So I was struggling to raise capital for about 3 years, right? But when I was 21, everything changed. So I don't mean to get too biblical on you, right? Is it okay if I share the story?
Of course, sure.
Okay, so it happens to be in the Bible. There was no altar call or anything like that, right? I'm not going to ask people to buy my prayer stone or, you know. So I remember I was 21. I was extremely frustrated because by that point I was studying finance and real estate for a good amount of years. But yeah, I was continuing to make no money. There's this story in the Bible where Jesus and his disciples are walking into the Passover feast. And all of a sudden, Jesus has this realization that he's the most powerful being in the universe, right? As a matter of, in scripture, the word for word scripture says that Jesus knew at that time that, you know, the Father had put everything under his authority and that he was from the Father and then returning to the Father. And what's really interesting is that what he does after that, right? Like I consider Jesus to be the greatest leader to ever walk the earth. But what Jesus does after that is he chooses to do the thing that was actually reserved for the lowest ranking servant, which is to wash the feet. So he begins to wash the feet of his disciples. And their feet, by the way, it's not like what it is now where we have socks and shoes. It was stinky, very nasty, right? Like they were stepping in all kinds of stuff throughout the day. And so at the height of his power, he chose to do the most humbling thing. And at that point, God used that story when I was 21 to demonstrate to me, he's like, Daniel, you're a smart kid. You have a lot of great ways of finding out, you know, methods to generate whatever. But the problem is every single room you walk out of, the people's feet are still dirty. And so that shifted the philosophy of my business, right? And that's why even with seller financing, like I won't do it unless it does genuinely serve them, right?
So are you walking around with like a wash bucket now and a couple of washcloths? Is that what you
Metaphorically, yes. Yeah, absolutely, man. Metaphorically, I'm the janitor, man. Yeah, that's right. So
but make a connection now. So how are you?
Yeah, so the connection was, okay, I got to focus on helping other people. I got to bring value. I got to serve. So what I did in lieu of that story, the action step that followed that story was I walked around. So I belonged to a couple of different real estate investing networking events at the time that were meeting weekly. And I probably saw between 500 to 600 people on a weekly basis that were all real estate investors interested in real estate. So what I did is I grabbed a notepad and I walked around and I asked almost every single one of those people, what are your biggest obstacles that you currently have in your business, right? What's your greatest problem you have in real estate? And I found that a lot of people lacked capital. Like 60% of people are like, well, I need capital to do deals. However, 5% of those people, 5 to 10% of those people said something along the lines of, you know what, Daniel, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I make $750,000 a year. My CPA is telling me I desperately need to get involved with some real estate for tax benefits and long-term gain. But I don't have the time. I don't have the money. Or I have the money, but I don't have the time. I don't have the expertise or the team to actually implement all these things and buy real estate. Like I just don't have that bandwidth. So for me, that was just an easy problem to solve. Right. I was like, well, hey, you know, I've got people who have a little bit more track record than I do, would it be value? But I am really smart with analyzing deals. Like I'm book smart. I just don't happen to have the experience. So would it be any value to you if I rounded up all these people that I talked to, that I got their email addresses of people that want capital, and then I vetted those deals and I sent them over to you? Would that be any value? And they were like, well, yeah. So I started connecting people without expecting anything in return. And one day a guy called me. He was like, hey, I really appreciate you setting me up with, John, who put $300,000 towards my deal. Do you want 20% of it? And I said, yeah, sure, absolutely. And so now I started learning as an actual partner, and that's how I built my track record. And then I started going off and doing my own deals. And so I had something to show. But even if you don't have a track record, I tell even my students, like when you're building relationships with investors, because at the end of the day, you're not raising capital. You're building relationships with people who have capital. That's what you're doing, right? Same thing with real estate, like the sellers. Right? I tell people all the time, never look for properties, look for people. If you do that, your entire business will change, So even my clients that try to raise capital with no track record, I tell them like, look, don't bring it up. Like, don't bring up the fact that you don't have a track record. Like, but however, like have a really kick-ass product. And but when I say product, the breakdown of what product means is you're part of the product as the operator of the real estate business. You are part of the product. You're the most important part of the product, actually. Number two, there's a blueprint and a strategy. That's part of the product. At the end of the day, when people put money into something, they're putting money in you, but they're also putting money in a strategy, in a blueprint. And last but not least, they're putting money in an asset, right? So the unique deal that you're bringing them, which, by the way, that's the least important part. Even if you don't have a deal, you can still raise capital. You can still build relationships with individuals because you're selling them on you and a strategy and a hypothetical asset, right? Like an asset that, like I told investors throughout the years all the time, like, look, I don't have a deal right now, but here's what we're looking for. Here's an example deal of what we're looking at, right? So if I bring you a deal, it's going to look a lot like this, right? So that people actually, okay, it's tangible. There's tangibility there. There's something that I know is associated to what I'm investing into. So with everybody raising capital, if you find out what your product is, those three things, and at the same time you identify who your ideal client is, like your avatar, who you're targeting, you're going to have a much easier time raising capital than you are now. Most people struggle because they don't know what those two things are. They don't know what their product is, and they don't know who their ideal clients are. So even like what I did with the seller, I did the same thing with investors and found out that doctors and physicians were the ideal people to invest with me because their values aligned with mine, my business strategy, who I was, all the things that I valued in real estate, they valued in real estate as well. And then I had, and this is my last thing, I had something that was unstoppable. Like and I use the word unstoppable for a reason. Right?
Yeah, you have me, brother.
That's right. I had Billy in my corner, right? So I had something that was unstoppable, which was what I call the irresistible offer. So this is the one thing that gets people to want to work with you more than anybody else. And my irresistible offer to my doctors was, well, first and foremost, what are they valuing? So I did the same thing I did with sellers. I did a survey. I asked 3 to 4 doctors at the time, like, hey, what do you really value in real estate? Why are you getting into real estate? What's most important to you? And this answer kept coming up over and over and over again, which was tax benefits, right? They were like, well, like, Daniel, I don't necessarily need the cash flow. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I want the deal to have cash flow, but I make $750,000 a year. I make $500,000 a year. I don't necessarily need the cash flow, but I do want the depreciation and I do want the equity growth, right? Like the long-term equity growth. So my irresistible offer was I would give my investors 100% of all the depreciation. That was my irresistible offer. So even as like taking on equity, like LPs, right? Limited partners, they would have 50%, 60%, right? I would actually give at the time 40% to my LPs, and the GP would take 60%. And I was beating out, right? Like I was beating out other guys who were giving their LPs 60% because of my irresistible offer.
Which was the depreciation.
That's exactly right. I was giving them 100% depreciation because, again, I listened to what they wanted and I just gave it to them, right? So I think if you want to be a master of raising capital, have a really clear understanding of what your product is, have a really clear understanding of who your ideal client is, and then use those information to formulate your irresistible offer. If you can do those three things,
Daniel, that's the key. Finding out who your avatar is key, because the message that most people go out with is cash flow, passive income, cash flow. And that's going to serve a certain amount of people. But if you're having that message to a high net worth individual or a high income individual, they don't give a shit about cash flow. They care about depreciation and saving as much money as possible off their tax returns. And of course, the equity buildup over time.
Which, by the way, even if you talk to the investors that have $10 million plus, like the big whales, right? And I'm not talking about family offices. I'm not talking about institutions with 10 million plus. I'm talking about with an individual with 10 million plus. Their main priority isn't return. It's risk, right? Like if you really want to know, like that's what they really want to hear about. Like they could care less about returns. They can go to their stockbroker or whatever, and they'll get a 9% return, 12% return. But what they really care about is risk.
And to say it differently, it's risk. It's really capital preservation. That's the number one thing that the high net worth individuals and these family offices care about. And they'll take a 4%, 5% return as long as their initial capital in is safe and secure. Capital preservation with that type of avatar is key.
That's exactly right. And that's what kind of leads into like really understand the psychographics of your ideal client. Like, what do they care about? What do they think? How do they think? What drives them to make decisions? Like, for me, that's what I want to know. That's what I'm obsessed with.
I got to tell you, man, it took you 3 years to get yourself going, but just listening, and I got to know you over this 45 minutes. You really take your time in understanding, like you ask a shit ton of questions, took you time to get yourself going. But once you get on that path, because of the information, the data that you collected and how you went about, you had a lot of intent with the way you put yourself together. Everything across the board from a childhood to what you're doing today, there's a lot of intent with what you're doing. And I have a lot of respect for you, bro. You're doing really, really well, Daniel. Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, that's one of the things I tell people all the time. It's like everyone's looking for the shortcut. Like I guarantee you some people are listening to this podcast right now, hoping to get that one thing that's going to like, oh my God, it's going to change it. And maybe you did, maybe you didn't, right? But if there's anything that you could take away was the intentionality for me.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's key. Is nothing can be an accident when it comes to your business. You know, like I was watching the Last Dance, right, with the Michael Jordan documentary, right, with the Bulls, and you know, man, that guy, you know, everything was intentional. Like everything was on purpose. Everything was intentional. I mean, from his workout to the people who he chose to be around him, you know, and I mean, like every step and every dribble had a purpose, you know. And that's the same thing we should do with our business, because at the end of the day, you know, business, sports are all the same. There's levels to this stuff, right? Like there's levels to this thing in real estate investing and wealth creation and being unstoppable. There's levels to it. And for me, like ever since I was young, you know, ever since I started my business, like I had no interest in doing things at the lowest level or even the mid-level. Even the fundamental things that I was learning, like the equivalent of learning how to dribble in basketball, dribble basketball, I wanted to do it at the highest level. And I think that's for me, it's probably my last nugget I'll share, but it's like, I remember I had the pleasure of speaking with a pro athlete, and I won't mention who this person is because I don't want to come across as the guy who name drops, but I asked him like, hey, what separates you, you know, from the guys who played in college, who were the same size, as fast, as smart as you are? What separates you from them? And I remember he told me, you know, the reason why I reached the highest level of my sport was because even the little things, like the fundamentals, I try to do it at the highest level. You know, like I asked myself, man, how would the GOAT, right, the greatest one, like how would a GOAT do this? Like even if it was washing my hands or, you know, brushing my teeth or putting my shoes on or tying my shoes, you know, or even just, you know, stretching or running a simple 100 yards, like how would the highest level, what does that look like, right? What does that highest level look like for me? And so, you know, that really struck home with me, because even for you guys that are just starting out in real estate, even if you're learning what a cap rate is, right? Like do it at the highest level. You know, try to do it as, okay, how would a veteran approach this? You know, if you can do that, man, you'd be surprised of what only doing that for 3 years, what that would bring you.
Daniel, this was very informative, very good. You're a good speaker. You have a lot of knowledge, a lot of drive, and you are living with intent, brother. Really appreciate you, dude. Congratulations with everything. If people want to get in touch with you, how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I love people, man. So, you know, this is a little weird, but I'll actually give out my personal email address. So if people even if they want to say hi, they don't have a question or they don't have anything they want. You know, my email is daniel@thekwakbrothers.com. So it's just DANIEL and then the Kwak Brothers at the S at the end.com. And like I said, if people just want to say hi, if they have a question, I'd be more than happy to talk.
Awesome, bro. Thank you so much for coming on. Stay on. I'm going to end this and we'll talk right after.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks, Billy.
Bye-bye.